I got elected on making government better, more efficient, and smaller. And that's what we're doing. And I think it was a very generous buyout, actually. Also, if people don't show up to work, we have a right to fire them.
The United States is officially in recession. Huge breaking news. ADP payrolls showed that America lost 30,000 jobs last month. That comes after losing jobs in the past 2 consecutive months. It's official, we're in a recession.
The world didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. While the U.S. economy shook from the sudden disappearance of 1 million jobs overnight, Africa was celebrating something the West never believed could happen in cities across the continent. Factories roared to life, cargo ships overloaded with new exports sailed toward global markets, and millions of young Africans watched their countries rise faster than anyone predicted. American news networks scrambled for answers.
The ALO warns of job losses in the U.S. The International Labor Organization has warned about potential job losses in the United States due to the advances in artificial intelligence. Sectors such as manufacturing, transportation, and financial services could be especially affected as machines and algorithms may replace tasks previously performed by humans. The ILO also warns that this rapid technological shift could worsen labor inequalities. Workers with
How could a continent the U.S. once underestimated suddenly become the world's fastest-growing production powerhouse? How could Africa expose the U.S.'s hidden weaknesses so brutally? And why was a massive corporate exodus migrating from American cities to African free trade zones at a pace no one had ever seen? Behind the panic was a truth Washington had ignored for decades. Africa had been quietly studying every flaw in the Americans, so every loophole, every dependency, every fragile industry.
Now, what this means is that almost all the products for export from these countries heading towards China will be exempt from paying things like duty, for example. So this is a win for these African countries. But more importantly, it goes to show the cooperation between China and Africa and how deeply cemented the friendship between these two sides is, not just in the past, in the present, but also moving forward.
And now it was using that knowledge to flip the global power dynamic as African nations united under bold new policies, investment treaties, and optimized digital trade networks, and U.S. corporations found something irresistible: cheaper energy, faster labor mobilization, zero tariffs between African states, and governments ready to embrace innovation without bureaucracy. What no one expected was what came next.
The United States is officially in recession. Huge breaking news. ADP payroll showed that America lost 30,000 jobs last month. That comes after losing jobs in the past 2 consecutive months. It's official. We're in a recession.
African officials released a confidential report proving that for years, U.S. companies had been using Africa as a testing ground, while quietly underestimating its ability to adapt and evolve. That underestimation became America's greatest weakness. By the time the report went public, global investors had already moved billions from U.S. markets into African mega-projects. Manufacturing giants left American shores. Tech firms relocated their innovation hubs.
Nevada is losing thousands of construction jobs as economic uncertainty remains high, according to a new report. In August, Nevada construction jobs fell 6.4% from a year earlier, according to the report from the Associated General Contractors of America. That's equivalent to 7,100 construction jobs lost, as experts are blaming a slowing housing market.
It's just really cost prohibitive right now.
The shockwaves began quietly, the kind of distant tremors that most Americans brushed off as nothing more than global noise. But within months, those tremors grew into a nationwide earthquake that shook the U.S. economy to its core. What no one expected was that the catalyst for this upheaval would come from Africa, a continent Washington had long underestimated, misunderstood, and taken for granted. For years, American corporations believed Africa was simply a source of raw materials, cheap imports, and low-cost labor. But something had been shifting under the surface. Africa had been building, coordinating, and preparing for a transformation so dramatic that when it finally unfolded, the U.S. economy was left staggering Africa. wasn't rising quietly anymore. Africa was rising loudly, so loudly that the world could no longer ignore it. It started with a massive announcement from West Africa. The region revealed a new unified industrial plan designed to replace American contracts across multiple industries. Pharmaceutical manufacturing hubs were being built in Ghana and Senegal. Electric vehicle battery factories were rising in Nigeria. Tech infrastructure centers were emerging in Kenya, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. For the first time, Africa wasn't exporting its resources for pennies, it was keeping them to produce profitable goods on its own soil. American companies panicked as soon as the news went public. For decades, they relied on Africa's minerals, agricultural products, and cheap shipping routes. But now Africa was reclaiming that value. The U.S. was about to face something it had never prepared for, competition from a continent it assumed would never challenge its economic dominance. The panic grew worse when Africa's new economic bloc announced its next move. The continent would be restricting exports of several critical minerals unless foreign nations agreed to new terms. These minerals, cobalt, manganese, rare earth elements, lithium, platinum, were essential to American tech manufacturing, aerospace engineering, and electric vehicle production. Without them, entire U.S. industries would collapse. Almost overnight, American factories shut down assembly lines. Stores started rationing electronic products. Companies from California to Michigan announced layoffs by the thousands. Within weeks, the number of unemployed Americans reached over 1 million, an economic shock the U.S. government had not experienced in decades. While America scrambled, Africa advanced. East African nations revealed a massive agricultural innovation network powered by new tech partnerships with Asia. Southern Africa rolled out a groundbreaking green energy project that instantly attracted global investors. North Africa expanded its logistics corridors, making it the new gateway for maritime routes between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Africa was building a future so profitable that even American corporations were desperate to gain access. But Africa was no longer handing out access freely. The continent had studied the world's major economies for decades and had learned exactly how to shift global power without firing a shot. Instead of aggression, Africa used control of resources, control of trade routes, control of supply chains that the U.S. could not survive without. The strategy was brilliant and brutally effective. Inside Washington, meetings stretched late into the night. Officials paced crowded rooms, debating how the U.S. could regain leverage. But every report they reviewed led to the same conclusion. America had grown comfortable, assuming Africa would remain dependent forever. Meanwhile, Africa had spent years building alliances with Asia, the Middle East, South America, and even parts of Europe. These countries offered Africa something the U.S. never did: respect and partnership, not dominance and control. As Africa rose, American citizens finally saw the consequences of the country's long-term economic neglect. The technology sector suffered the worst. Computer manufacturers ran out of components. Smartphone companies delayed product launches. Automobile plants froze production. Even aerospace corporations, which were supposed to be untouchable, faced crippling shortages of critical metals. Millions of Americans demanded answers. How had the U.S. economy become so vulnerable? How did a nation once considered the world's strongest suddenly depend so heavily on Africa? And why had no one prepared for the possibility that Africa might rise? The uncomfortable truth was that American leaders had ignored Africa's growth. While U.S. politicians repeated outdated narratives, Africa built the world's fastest-growing cities, the largest free trade zone on the planet, and a resource-based economy that could dictate global prices. The U.S. had overlooked Africa, and now Africa was showing the world exactly why that was a mistake. Africa's message came through loud and clear. If the U.S. wanted access to the continent's markets, industries, and resources, then it would have to play by Africa's terms. No more one-sided deals, no more hidden clauses, no more exploitation disguised as development assistance. The era of America controlling Africa's economy was over. The new era was Africa controlling its own destiny and America reacting to it. U.S. corporations begged Washington to negotiate, but negotiations weren't as simple as they once were. Africa wasn't seeking temporary concessions. The continent wanted long-term equality, respect, and economic independence. And with its new alliances, Africa didn't need American approval anymore. Global investors began reallocating their funds. African stock markets surged, infrastructure bonds sold out instantly. International companies opened regional headquarters in Nairobi, Lagos, Cairo, and Johannesburg. The world's biggest tech giants announced partnerships with African universities and innovation hubs. Africa wasn't just rising, it was becoming the center of global economic gravity. Meanwhile, the U.S. continued to lose jobs, manufacturing. Plants closed, entire sectors downsized, consumers faced skyrocketing prices as imported goods became rare or expensive. The economic shock spread rapidly, proving that the U.S. economy had never been as invincible as it seemed, but Africa didn't gloat. Instead, African leaders offered a simple explanation during a global press conference. The continent was not trying to hurt America. Africa was simply prioritizing itself after centuries of being controlled. Manipulated and undervalued, the world had changed, and Africa was finally stepping into the power it always deserved. The reporters in the room were stunned. For the first time in history, Africa wasn't asking for recognition, Africa was commanding it, and the U.S., shaken and exposed, had no choice but to confront a new reality. Africa was no longer a supporting actor on the world stage. Africa was now one of the main powers shaping the future. The rise the U.S. never saw coming had finally arrived. The fallout from Africa's bold economic realignment didn't settle, it expanded. Day by day, the consequences multiplied across the United States, each ripple revealing just how deeply America had tied its prosperity to a world it thought it controlled. What stunned analysts most wasn't Africa's rise, but the speed at which the U.S. economy collapsed under its own weight once Africa shifted its strategy. American news outlets tried to soften the blow at first. They blamed temporary shortages, supply chain restructuring, and global market fluctuations. But the truth was too big to hide. Every industry report pointed to the same source: Africa, or more specifically, Africa's refusal to keep playing by America's rules. What caught Americans off guard was how coordinated Africa's actions were. The continent didn't move randomly. West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, North Africa, and Central Africa had all synchronized their policies with precision. It was an economic formation unlike anything the U.S. had ever witnessed. Africa was moving like a single, powerful entity, and Washington had no response. As more U.S. industries collapsed, Africa was rising. In every direction, East Africa unveiled a groundbreaking digital payment network that rivaled the systems used in Silicon Valley. Built on blockchain and local currencies, it eliminated America's ability to influence monetary flows in the region. Within weeks, over half the continent adopted the platform. Southern Africa then launched its new mineral exchange, a trading system where African countries set the price of their own resources. No more discount rates. For American manufacturers, no more long-term contracts that favored U.S. corporations. The U.S. tech sector spiraled instantly. Prices for critical components surged by 300%. Companies froze hiring, internships evaporated, entire career paths vanished overnight. North Africa made its move next. The region announced a sweeping overhaul of energy exports. Instead of shipping cheap oil and gas to global buyers, it signed exclusive contracts with partners that respected Africa's terms, primarily Asia and the Middle East. The U.S., already struggling with internal energy debates, suddenly faced unprecedented shortages. Fuel prices tripled, airlines canceled flights, freight companies halted operations, and then came the moment that truly broke the U.S. labor market. West Africa revealed its new agricultural independence model: advanced irrigation. AI-driven farming and vertical agriculture transformed the region from a raw exporter into a global food powerhouse. Africa was no longer selling raw crops to the U.S. at low prices. It was exporting finished products, packaged goods, processed foods, and premium brands directly to global consumers. American farmers couldn't compete. Agricultural jobs vanished by the tens of thousands. Whole towns collapsed. The U.S. government tried emergency interventions. It offered subsidies, tax breaks, and stimulus checks. But none of it addressed the core problem. Africa now commanded what America needed most: not land, not oil, not cheap labor, but control of the world's future industries. Africa held the minerals for batteries, electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, aerospace systems, and advanced electronics. Without Africa, the U.S. had no path to technological leadership. While America scrambled, Africa was celebrating a new era. African cities that had once been overlooked were now global magnets. Lagos became a financial hub, Nairobi became a tech capital, Cairo became a logistics corridor, Johannesburg became the gateway for global energy markets. Factories opened, jobs multiplied, investors flooded in. Africa wasn't rising slowly, it was accelerating. International organizations began shifting their headquarters to African cities. Global universities opened campuses in Ghana and Kenya. Major airlines rerouted their international hubs through Addis Ababa. Africa had become the center of gravity for global development. Meanwhile, U.S. citizens felt the crisis on a personal level. Tech workers were the first hit. The once booming industry struggled to keep up with rising component prices. Companies that had been hiring aggressively were now downsizing. Workers who used to enjoy high-paying remote jobs found themselves competing for low-wage positions just to stay afloat. Retail workers felt the second wave. With imports from Africa now expensive and limited, American stores ran out of inventory. Shelves sat empty. Prices soared, consumers cut spending, forcing stores to shut down and lay off staff. Manufacturing workers suffered the third wave. Without African minerals, U.S. factories couldn't produce cars, electronics, or appliances. Entire assembly lines went dark, employers filed bankruptcy, the job losses skyrocketed, the million-job collapse. Wasn't just a statistic, it was a national emergency. But Africa didn't retaliate, it didn't gloat, it didn't celebrate America's hardship. Instead, African leaders delivered a unified message during a globally televised address. The crisis was a result of America's decades-long refusal to build fair partnerships. They explained it calmly. Africa had offered collaboration. Africa had asked for balanced trade. Africa had requested technology transfers, manufacturing deals, and equitable contracts. America ignored all of it. Africa emphasized that its rise wasn't an attack, it was a necessity. The continent had simply prioritized its own growth, its own people, and its own economic independence. What made the moment historic was not that Africa exposed America, it was that America had exposed itself. Africa simply revealed the reality the U.S. hoped the world would never see. The global response was instant. Nations applauded Africa for demonstrating leadership without aggression. Analysts praised the continent for accomplishing what no superpower had achieved in decades, reshaping the global economy using strategy instead of conflict. And while Africa rose, a transformation began within the United States. Driven by frustration, awakening, and realization, Americans demanded accountability. They questioned why their leaders underestimated Africa. They challenged the policies that tied the U.S. economy to outdated systems. Protests erupted across several states, not against Africa, but against the institutions that allowed America to fall behind. As awareness spread, something unexpected happened. Many Americans began looking to Africa not with arrogance, but with curiosity, admiration, and a desire to learn. They studied Africa's innovation hubs, energy policies, trade frameworks, and resource strategies. For the first time in modern history, the U.S. looked to Africa not as a supplier or a client, but as a model. Africa, rising with confidence and stability, extended a hand, not because the U.S. was powerful, but because Africa now was. The world had shifted, and this time Africa wasn't behind. Africa was leading.